Okay guys, today I'm going to be installing an Intellitronics cluster into my 86 Camaro. Comes just with bare wires on it off the back, and each wire is labeled here on the very front. Tells you what they're supposed to go to. I opted to install these two plugs instead of connecting it to the original cluster, mostly because I found that I was having some higher resistance issues through the cluster connections, and that old style connection just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. One thing that I did notice is that the cluster does not come with that nice little high beam indicator in it, so you will have to remove that from the old one. Make sure you use something that won't conduct electricity, like liquid electrical tape or some clear scotch tape or something along those lines, and get that lined up over that hole. Install that to the cluster first. So I went ahead and heat shrinked and soldered all those connectors on, got those ready to go, so my cluster is ready. Over at the vehicle, I will show you what the connectors inside look like. With the entire cluster removed, you'll see on the left side of the dash here I've got a black connector, on the right side I got a clear connector, and then I've got my two connectors that I installed hanging down right now. What I did is I actually used some auto strippers to pull the sheathing back on the wire, so I didn't actually cut the wires. Wrapped them through it and then used liquid electrical tape to make sure they were sealed up, and then reinstalled everything. The only modification that I did have to make was here on the passenger side of the cluster. I cut one hole, which if you look at the back of it, I didn't actually have to modify any of the circuitry board at all. Just cut the plastic out so that my plug could fit through there. On the other side, after everything additional that didn't need to be there was removed, there's already a hole for my plug. I also took out all the bulbs for the backlighting. Only left in my turn signals and my indicators for like my check engine light. Removed the portion for the OE cruise control, because obviously it has nothing to read anyways. So now I'm going to reinstall this white plastic backing, which is just held on with two screws down in this bottom corner down here. One there and one down here. Fish my plugs through here, and then it should just be a matter of throwing a few screws in to put my cluster back together and plugging those two plugs in. Alright, so if you look back in here, you can see all the connectors where the old gauges went in. That's what I've seen some people do, is they just put a spade terminal on and they connect to these. Obviously, like I told you, I had some resistance issues that I was finding from the connections down here at the circuit board. That'll obviously affect the way that your gauges work, so I opted to put those two plugs in, which you can see I've got my white plastic installed, the backing of the cluster, and I've got my two connectors fished through my two holes here. For those of you who are opting to do what I've done here and put some connectors on here, I can give you some additional information. From everything that I'm finding, this body style looks like they're all using the same colored wires. So I can't imagine that there's much different. If you want to track it down, just follow your signal wire on the back of the cluster. When you pull it out, follow the circuit board and make sure they go to the same pins, but you'll see two connectors. On the left side, on the driver's side, there's a black plug. On the passenger side, or the right side, there's a clear plug. Your ground is on the black plug, pin 9, and on each plug, once you have this off, you'll see numbers by each pin. So pin 9 is your ground. On the black plug, pin 11 is your dimmer lights. On the black plug, pin 7 is your coolant or water temperature. And then on the clear plug, pin 4 is your fuel sender. Your pin 11 on the clear plug is your RPM reference. Pin 13 on the clear is your oil pressure. And pin 10 on the clear plug would be a battery power, or a key on power actually. The only thing that is not taken care of in those two plugs is the speed sensor wire. Obviously, because you're transferring over from a speed cable to a sensor, which Intellitronics will include with it. You'll have to run your own 3 wires harness up for those. I opted to run mine in through the firewall, also back to here, and then use my additional plug that I had left on the black plug, because there's only 3 in there, for my speed signal. So now all I should have to do is plug in my 2 plugs and basically screw everything in. The only thing that you'll still have to figure out for yourself where you want to mount your trip button. The other nice thing about having those plugs back there is going to be that if I do ever have an issue, or maybe want to put it back to factory for some reason, or anything along those lines, a little easier to remove it, and I haven't actually interfered at all with the OE stuff really, to where I can't just go ahead and pull it right out and unplug it and put the OE factory cluster gauges back in. I was having some issues with them in terms of reading right, so that is why we're getting into all of this. Probably going to go ahead and shut this off while I just throw a couple of screws in here and get some things lined up, and we'll move forward. Alright guys, so I've put all my small screws in here to hold the circuit board in place, or the new cluster in place. Getting ready to install the rest of the stuff here. Everything else that you took out pretty much is useless other than the outside cover. And just kind of lay the tinted plastic here in place. Bring your outside fascia back in. And the hardest part here is you've actually got to kind of hold the inside plastic in place and line up the outside plastic. There's only 2 screws that actually hold that in place. Throw those 2 screws in so that it lines up and stays where it needs to be. And then the rest of them for the cover here. If I didn't mention this already, make sure that you don't take out all of the bulbs out of the original plastic cluster, because you won't get turn signals, obviously you won't get your high beam indicators, you won't get your check engine light, your brake lights, those kind of things. If you have a manual, your clutch shift light. So make sure you don't take out all the bulbs. Be very careful to make sure you're only taking out the ones that backlight this thing, because you have no use for those anymore. You probably could leave them in, but I didn't in my case, just because I didn't want to take any chance of any extra light getting pushed to the back and looking kind of weird. Sorry about that, my dog's a little crazy sometimes. Alright, so I got a few more screws here. I'm just going to snug up, tighten up, but you got to get the gist of what it'll look like here. I also have the bottom cover down here I got to put back on from where I routed my harness in for my speed sensor. The only real things that you really should have to change out under the hood, they give you a new coolant temp sensor that is set up to read properly with this. So have to change that out, and the pigtail, or the end of it, is different, so you will have to put a new spade terminal on the end of that. Doing it this way, you shouldn't have to tap in any wires under the hood, which keeps you from having to worry about corrosion, bad connections, anything like that outside, making your connections inside under the dash are a little bit more protected. And then obviously you'll have to run your new 3-wire harness from under the hood, carefully down under the vehicle, away from exhaust, that kind of stuff. Remove the speed cable from the transmission and install that, the new sensor, and then plug your harness in. Okay, so we are mostly installed here. Ran into a couple of snags. One thing is the speed sensor that they sent with this cluster isn't deep enough to actually fit on the transmission, so I had to do some temporary stuff so that it stays in place, so that I can at least make sure everything else works. Also, I don't know if you can see my oil pressure is reading about 82, 83 right now, sitting at idle. I know that's wrong. My motor makes about 65 when it's cold, as it is right now. Lastly, the water temperature here, I do not trust it. mostly because it was about 70 degrees today when I installed it, and before I started running the car it was reading about 34 degrees. But that is with the OE, or the original sending unit, in the block still. The one that they sent does not fit in my block at all with either of the adapters that they sent. So those are the things I'm going to have to actually contact the people that made the cluster and see how they want me to approach this. But I'll show you here real quick that what I've got. My speed sensor is working. Any other questions, I guess maybe tag below or try to contact me. Maybe I can help you out. From there, I hope you enjoy this. Thanks.